We have here with us today Alistair Currie from Population Matters, and he's going to talk to us about climate change, animal rights, overpopulation, and everything else we have on the agenda. So hello Alistair, thank you very much for coming.
It's my pleasure, it's great to be here.
You have an extensive experience in the animal rights world, and you worked for PETA for 15 years. So how did your animal rights journey start?
My animal rights journey actually started back in the early 80s when a friend of mine who was vegetarian, who was clearly a hippie idiot, I took it upon myself to persuade him that he was wrong about that, and he simply persuaded me that he was right, that there is no justification for treating animals as though they're things, that they suffer just as we do, so we should respect them. And it really began at that point, but it took a few years. I turned vegetarian at that point, and it was actually an activist from PETA came to speak to my local animal rights group, and I thought she was fantastic, and I thought, imagine being paid to campaign for animals, and I was very fortunate to get a job in an organisation here in Sheffield, in fact, working.
Mm-hmm. And you work for Uncaged?
I work for Uncaged, which is an organisation that was here in Sheffield 20 years ago, and from then went on to work at Viva, which is a vegetarian organisation, British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, which is now called Cruelty Free International, and then PETA after that.
And tell me some of the challenges that you faced in these various jobs.
Things have changed a little now, but back when I first started in this area, veganism was so incredibly weird that you simply saying announcing that you're vegan made you beyond the pale, kind of not someone to be taken seriously, and it's fantastic and to see the change that's been just the last few years. I think in the vegan world, particularly those of us who've been there for a long time, we get sort of very excited about it, and we have to remember it's still a tiny minority of people, but the change has been enormous. But back then, it was a credibility issue, really. If you declared yourself as being an animal rights activist, you lost credibility, and that was very difficult, in particular working on animal experiments, which I did for a long time, because animal experiments is quite a hardcore issue. There's a lot of science, there's a lot of policy involved in that, and you have to work hard to demonstrate that you weren't just an ideologue, you were someone who actually understood what the issues were and had a practical contribution to make.
Mm-hmm. And were you involved in some way in policy making?
Lobbying at the time that I was active in animal experiments, the European Union was revising its the legislation which governs the regulation of animal experiments, so ourselves and everyone involved in the field was pushing hard to try and make it obviously as humane as possible. Clearly we would prefer it to all have been banned, but that wasn't a policy option. The other area that I worked on was a massive piece of European legislation on chemicals testing, which essentially required safety testing using animals for every chemical in use in Europe, potentially leading to millions of animal experiments, and that was very hardcore, quite technical, very specific work of just trying to chip away and say, actually, there's an alternative to this experiment, you can't justify this, you can't justify that. Very much not in the sort of the abstract ideological sphere, but in the hardcore, making incremental differences sphere.
After your really long career in animal rights activism, you shifted for Population Matters. So how come you made that transition?
Well, actually, in between animal rights and Population Matters, I worked for Free Tibet, which was a wonderful place to work, a very important cause, and very much in common with animal rights. It's essentially about someone with a lot of power using that to impose and suffering on those who don't have power, the Chinese government and the Tibetan people. And so it's a justice issue. Justice is what's at the heart of animal rights.
So in terms of SDGs now that are coming to being, how do you see the concept of population figuring in the sustainability goals?
If you look at the sustainability goals, there is the population component in almost all of them, or there should be a population component in almost all of them, but it's really not being sort of acknowledged properly at the moment. And people focus, understandably, in many cases on the downstream issues, the immediate problem, without looking at the big driver, which for many of them. So among the SDGs, obvious ones, end to hunger, food security is very important, number of people eating. Climate change is very much the big one. While we're adding more carbon emitters to the planet, and we're running to stand still in terms of addressing climate change. but also sustainable production and consumption. I could enumerate every single one of them and find a population angle in it, but fundamentally, the more of us there are, the more production there has to be, and the more consumption there has to be. That's inevitable. If we can reduce the number of consumers, reduce the amount of production, and all the damage that comes from that, it's not a magic wand. It's not going to solve our problems, but it's going to make it a lot easier to solve our problems. So we would very much hope, and there is discussion in the sort of population movement at the moment about how we can bring that much more to the fore, to have policymakers and the UN look at the big picture of population, but it's very, very challenging.
So do you see a link between overpopulation and extinction?
There's clearly a link between overpopulation and extinction. If you draw a graph, they run in parallel with one another, and as you'd be well aware, we're talking about sixth mass extinction, which is taking place at the moment, and time and again, scientists and conservationists are identifying population as the problem. Of course, there are multiple factors in it, but essentially we all know how important habitat loss is, and also what they call harvesting, which as an animal rights activist I would not describe as harvesting, I would describe it as killing, but nevertheless as these things arise because of demand from human beings, and in particular the more of us there are, the more space we demand. We're going to be invading the space of other animals, and that occurs in the UK just as much as it occurs where the metafauna are in Africa and other places. It's a fundamental link and relationship that go in parallel with one another.
Thank you very much, Alistair, for coming today, and it was fascinating talking to you, and I wish you all the best with your population endeavours.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here, and all the best with your endeavours.